Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen. Christopher Capozzola, who is James Montgomery Flagg?
James Montgomery Flagg is the man behind probably one of the most important images in American politics, the Uncle Sam Wants You poster. He was a graphic artist working in New York in the 1910s, and in that period after the war had started, but before the U.S. was involved in the war, Flagg wanted America to be more involved, and he wanted to come up with the perfect image that would get Americans into the military. And he's the one who gave us this image of Uncle Sam Wants You, that finger pointing out at the viewer.
Was he under contract to present that image?
He was at that time. He was working for a magazine, Leslie's Illustrated Weekly, which was a popular magazine of the day, and he was under a tight deadline to finish. And in fact, he didn't have a lot of ideas. And so the story as we know it, particularly from his memoir, is that he got an idea of just sort of coming up with a picture of himself, working from the mirror, looking into the mirror and sort of adding a few years to the image, putting on a funny hat and a suit, and that gave him the magazine cover. And it was a year or so later that the U.S. Army picked up the image and made it into a recruiting poster.
But at the time he created it, it was not a government effort to recruit soldiers.
No, it was a sort of popular image. It ran under a headline called "What Are You Doing for Preparedness?" Preparedness meaning sort of getting ready in case the U.S. was drawn into the European war.
So was there a national effort in 1916 to get into World War I?
There was. Some people actually wanted the U.S. to enter, especially people like Theodore Roosevelt, for example, who really felt that this was an international crisis, and even a humanitarian crisis of civilization, and the U.S. had an obligation to be involved. Others just wanted the U.S. to be more prepared, to have a larger army, to have more capabilities in case the world events dragged America into war. And then there were those who felt that this was a European problem that the U.S. should stay away from.
But not a centralized government effort.
There was not a centralized government effort, and in fact, Woodrow Wilson tried to avoid this as president because he worried that it was, he would end up alienating voters on both sides of the fence.
Then how did the U.S. get into World War I?
Well, despite Woodrow Wilson's efforts to keep America out of war, he made a series of decisions that slowly backed us into war, particularly by giving slight preference to Britain, by not trading with Germany. And then as the Germans in the spring of 1917, they launched a sort of desperate, last-minute gambit to win the war, knowing that they're going to drag the Americans into it. The Germans thought that the Americans didn't have a big army, they didn't have a strong federal government, and they would never get into the war in time to make a difference. And that's one place where they were wrong.
But prior to Woodrow Wilson's decisions, what were the grassroots separate efforts that got us into World War I?
Well, among the people who wanted the U.S. to be more prepared in this preparedness movement was a group of people, most of them Republicans, many of them disciples of Theodore Roosevelt, who set up sort of volunteer military training camps. A big one was in Plattsburgh, New York, and so it was called the Plattsburgh Movement. And often the kind of elite college students of the day would spend their summers training to be military officers, and many of them did become military officers. And in fact, after the war, the ROTC, as we know it today, really traces its roots back to this Plattsburgh movement.
So, was there a grassroots movement to get into the war? Was the war popular before the Americans got into it?
The war was popular with some people, but I think one of the things that most people forget about World War I was that it was very divisive, both entering the war and then how to fight the war after it starts. And a lot of that division and contest has kind of been forgotten in the years since then.
Where did your book, Uncle Sam Wants You, come from?
The book actually started from a puzzling group of people. So in a footnote of another book, I found reference to what were called slacker raids. And slacker was the slang term in World War I for draft dodgers. And slacker raids were carried out by a group of volunteers, mostly middle-aged men over draft age, who would go around in cities and small towns and try to track down the draft dodgers in their communities. And I thought, well, this is just unusual. People volunteering to enforce the draft, tens, literally 100, perhaps 200,000 people were part of this group, the American Protective League. So I started by researching them, and then it became a bigger story about America and its federal government in its first big World War.
Well, what was the effect on the federal government of World War I?
It was enormously transformative, and I think that historians have not paid enough attention to that because a lot of the organizations that got very large during the war got smaller after. So the Army got much bigger and then contracted. Our budget got much bigger and contracted, but it never went back to the small size that it was before. And that's an important turning point. And then the mindsets of a federal presence in everyday life were there for generations to come. And so when new crises came, whether it was the Great Depression or World War II, then the First World War was a previous image that other people looked at when they looked back at what should the federal government do.
And what was that previous image?
It was an image that was of tapping into voluntary associations, civil society, right? At the turn of the century, this is a time when people are active in clubs and fraternal lodges and trying to use that voluntary sensibility to mobilize the population, to mobilize the nation at a time when the state itself may not actually be that big.
So is that why you include the suffragists in this book?
I do, and I think that the war is a crucial moment for women's organizations, whether they were suffrage organizations or not. First of all, trying to find a place for themselves at a time when men's responsibilities are clearly stated, but women have to find their own place. And in fact, again, hundreds of thousands of them volunteer in various organizations on the home front, particularly in areas that were marked as women's spheres of activity: food, conservation, and things in the home.
Why is it that there was I don't know if it was a rise in anarchy, but a rise in domestic terrorism and instances of anarchists during this period?
Well, there had been violence particularly around questions of labor for quite a while before the war, but World War I marks this turning point, and for me it's captured in the word pro-German, which is a word that appears almost everywhere in the press during the First World War. But it may not have anything to do with actual Germans. Pretty much any subversive activity or violence or strikes could be labeled as pro-German. And so then a lot of the labor radicals who had been around throughout the period of industrialization found themselves really under the gun.
The term pro-German, was it used against a lot of people, and was it an effective tool?
It was used against pretty much anyone who was challenging the status quo. It was used against striking workers. It was used against African Americans who started to migrate from the rural South to the North. And it was effective in marginalizing and silencing them in some pretty remarkable ways.
Christopher Capozzola, Uncle Sam Wants You, World War I and the Making of the Modern American Citizen.
Thank you.